Samuel Carter had planned to
What are you doing
spend
here?
Christmas Eve the same way he spent
Due to
most
hunger, we
nights,
came here.
alone and undisturbed, with a simple meal warming on the stove and the lamp turned low so the shadows didn't invite memory. And he was already closing the barn door when movement near the fence caught his eye. Too deliberate to be wind and too still to be an animal. He paused, listening, feeling irritation surface first because solitude had become his only reliable comfort. Then something closer to concern, when two small figures stepped forward from the dark, thin enough to look unfinished against the snow. They didn't run or call out, only stood there watching him with the cautious stillness of children who had learned that being noticed too loudly could cost them more than it gained. Samuel asked what they were doing there, his voice rough from lack of use rather than anger, and when the older boy answered, it was with a careful honesty that named hunger without decoration, while the younger girl held tight to his coat as if letting go might scatter them both. Samuel noticed the signs immediately, the way their clothes hung loose, the way they conserved movement, the way the cold seemed already negotiated rather than feared, and he felt the familiar instinct rise to send them toward town and close the gate behind them. Christmas Eve had a way of making men careless, and carelessness had taught him painful lessons before. Still, hunger was not a story or a trick. It was a fact, and facts demanded response whether a man liked it or not. Without asking permission or offering comfort he wasn't ready to give, Samuel led them inside, set bread and stew on the table, and stepped back as if distance could keep the moment contained. The children ate slowly, measuring each bite, the boy pretending not to count while doing so anyway, the girl pausing between mouthfuls as if afraid the food might vanish if she trusted it too much. The silence was thick, but not awkward, broken only by the ticking clock and the faint sound of church bells drifting in from town, marking Christmas Eve for people who still gathered. Samuel told himself this was temporary, that the night would pass and reason would return with daylight. But as the children warmed by the fire and the house filled with a presence he hadn't allowed in years, he realized the evening had already changed shape. Whatever secret had brought them to his fence would come later, but the truth he could no longer ignore had already arrived. That loneliness was easier to carry when it was chosen, and far heavier when it was shared by accident on a night meant to remind people what they were missing. Morning arrived slowly, pale and quiet, the kind of Christmas dawn that softened the world without promising comfort. And Samuel Carter woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in his house, the creak of floorboards, and the careful clink of a spoon against a bowl. Small noises made by people who did not yet believe they were allowed to exist fully in someone else's space. He lay still for a moment, listening, reminding himself that this was temporary, that kindness did not have to become commitment. But the argument felt thinner in daylight than it had in the dark. When he stepped into the kitchen, the boy was already awake, standing on a chair to reach the counter, dividing the last of the bread with an attention that bordered on reverence, while the girl watched from the table, her hands wrapped around a mug as if warmth might escape if she loosened her grip. They froze when they saw him, bracing for correction, and Samuel felt a quiet discomfort settle in his chest at how quickly they expected to be sent away. He told them to sit, poured more water for the kettle, and asked their names as if names were not another form of staying. The boy answered first, Eli, his voice steady but guarded, and after a pause the girl said, Clara, glancing sideways at her brother as if checking whether it was safe to speak. They ate together without ceremony, the food simple and not nearly enough to erase what hunger had already taught them. And Samuel noticed how Eli kept track of what was left, how Clara deferred without complaint, patterns that spoke louder than any story. He asked where they had come from, keeping his tone even, and Eli hesitated before saying they had been staying where they could, moving when they had to, and that answer carried more weight than details ever could. Samuel felt the edge of the decision he had been avoiding sharpen, because children who moved that way did not do so by accident, and Christmas Eve encounters did not happen without a history pressing behind them. Outside, the bells rang again, brighter now, calling people toward warmth and gathering, and Samuel thought of the road he could still take, the one that would let him deliver them to town and return to silence before anything deeper took hold. Instead, he asked whether anyone would be looking for them, and the look that passed between the children was quick but unmistakable, a shared calculation shaped by fear and loyalty. Eli said not yet, his words chosen carefully, and Clara lowered her eyes as if the floor held answers she could not share. Samuel nodded, accepting what they were willing to give, but the space left by what they withheld pressed in on him, because secrets carried their own gravity. He told them they could stay until evening, no promises beyond that, and watched as relief flickered and vanished, replaced by caution learned too well. As the morning settled into its slow, uncertain peace, Samuel understood that hunger had brought them to his door, but it was something unspoken that had kept them there, and whatever it was, it would not allow the day to pass without asking him to decide what kind of man he intended to be once Christmas was no longer an excuse. The rest of Christmas Day unfolded with an uneasy calm that made Samuel Carter more alert than any noise ever could, because the children moved through his house as if measuring every step, careful not to disturb more than necessary, careful not to assume the space belonged to them, and that restraint told him more than any confession might have. Eli offered to help with chores without being asked, taking on work beyond his size with a seriousness that felt rehearsed, while Clara stayed close to the warmth, watching everything with eyes that missed nothing, her questions held back as if questions themselves were dangerous. Samuel found himself slowing his pace to match theirs, explaining small things he had never explained to anyone before. Not out of kindness exactly, but because silence felt heavier when shared. When he asked again, gently this time, about where they had been staying before Christmas Eve, Eli answered with half-truths shaped like answers, mentioning barns, empty sheds, and nights spent waiting for daylight but avoiding names, places, and timelines with a precision that made the omissions stand out more than the details offered. Samuel did not press, though the instinct to know sharpened with every vague reply, because he understood that some truths required trust before they could survive being spoken. Outside, neighbors passed on their way to holiday visits, slowing when they saw smoke from Samuel's chimney and unfamiliar figures through the window, curiosity stirring in a place that rarely had reason to look his way, and Samuel felt the old urge to close himself off, to return to the isolation that had kept questions at bay. Instead, he sent Eli to fetch water and asked Clara to help set the table, ordinary tasks that carried the quiet message that they were allowed to exist there without justification. As afternoon light faded, Samuel noticed how Eli flinched at distant voices and how Clara's hand found his sleeve whenever footsteps approached the house, small reactions that suggested they were not just hungry, but hiding, and that realization tightened the choice Samuel had been postponing. He told himself again that this was not his responsibility, that Christmas charity did not obligate a man to carry the weight of other people's pasts. But the argument faltered under the steady presence of two children who had already learned how quickly adults could disappear. When evening came and the bells rang once more, Clara finally spoke without being asked, saying softly that they should leave soon so they wouldn't cause trouble, and Samuel heard in her words not gratitude but preparation for loss. He told her they could stay through the night, the decision arriving before he had finished reasoning it through, and watched as Eli's shoulders eased just enough to betray relief he had tried to hide. As the fire burned low and the house settled into shared quiet again, Samuel understood that whatever secret the children were protecting was not simply a story they refused to tell, but a truth heavy enough to make leaving feel safer than trusting. And by choosing not to send them away, he had already stepped closer to it than he had intended. By the second night, silence stopped feeling neutral and began to feel deliberate, as if it were doing work of its own. And Samuel Carter sensed that the children were not merely withholding a story, but guarding something that could be taken from them if named too soon. Snow fell steadily outside, softening the world and making the house feel like a fragile island. And Samuel noticed how Eli positioned himself near doors and windows without realizing it, how his eyes tracked every sound that didn't belong to the wind. Clara slept lightly, waking at small noises and settling only when she could see her brother nearby. And Samuel lay awake, listening to their breathing, understanding that fear, when learned early, did not fade just because warmth returned. In the morning he suggested a walk to the creek, an ordinary thing meant to loosen the tightness that had settled over them, and the children agreed too quickly, as if leaving the house felt safer than staying where questions might follow. Outside, the cold sharpened their movements, and Samuel watched how Eli scanned the tree line before relaxing, how Clara stayed close enough to touch his coat, and the pattern formed itself without needing explanation. When Samuel asked, carefully, whether there was someone they were afraid might find them, Eli stopped walking, the decision to answer warring with the habit of caution. And after a long moment he said only that not everyone who looked for children did so to help them. The words were simple but precise, and Samuel felt the weight behind them settle into his chest, because he understood then that the secret was not a single event, but an ongoing risk. He told them they were safe where they were for now, meaning it without fully knowing how he would make it true, and the relief that crossed Eli's face was brief but unmistakable, followed quickly by the discipline of not trusting too much. Back at the house, Samuel took stock of what he had: limited supplies, distance from town, and a reputation for keeping to himself, and realized that those same qualities that had once protected his solitude might now protect something else. He did not ask for details he could not yet act on, choosing instead to set boundaries quietly, keeping the fire lit, the doors watched, and his movements predictable in a way that made safety easier to believe. That afternoon, a rider passed on the road and slowed, curiosity lingering longer than it needed to, and Samuel felt the decision harden inside him as he stepped into view, letting himself be seen as someone present and unhurried. The rider moved on, interest spent, and when Samuel returned inside, he found Clara watching him with an expression that held both fear and hope in equal measure. He knelt to her height and said nothing grand, only that she and her brother could stay as long as they needed. And though she did not answer, the way she leaned closer told him that silence had finally shifted, no longer hiding what they feared, but protecting what they were beginning to trust him with. The secret surfaced not all at once, but in fragments that fit together only after Samuel Carter stopped trying to solve them, because Eli spoke first in pieces, choosing words the way a man chose shelter in a storm, carefully and only when necessary. It happened late in the afternoon as snow lightened and the house filled with the quiet work of keeping warm, and Samuel noticed the boys' tension ease just enough for honesty to find a gap. Eli said they hadn't always been alone, that there had been an aunt who took them in after their parents died, and that for a while things had been manageable, even normal in the way hardship sometimes pretended to be. Clara stayed silent, tracing patterns in the frost on the window, while Eli explained that the arrangement changed when money ran thin and patience ran out, when promises began to carry conditions and kindness came attached to rules that felt heavier than hunger. Samuel listened without interruption, aware that interrupting would only teach the boy that adults preferred comfort to truth, And when Eli paused, struggling to continue, Clara whispered that they had been told they were a burden too many times to forget it. The words settled heavily, because Samuel understood how quickly being unwanted could teach children to disappear, and how disappearance often invited danger of a different kind. Eli admitted then that they had run when it became clear that staying meant something worse than neglect, something that could not be fixed by behaving better or eating less, and that they had been careful ever since, avoiding names, avoiding towns, avoiding anyone who asked too many questions. Samuel felt anger stir, not sharp and reckless, but slow and cold, because the world had not simply failed these children. It had taught them how to survive that failure without complaint. He asked what would happen if the person they had fled came looking, and Eli answered honestly that he didn't know, only that it had happened before, and that they had learned to move quickly when it did. The room felt smaller then, not because of fear alone, but because responsibility had finally taken shape, no longer abstract or optional. Samuel realized that sending them to town, to authorities, to well-meaning strangers might not mean safety at all, and that protecting them would require more than a meal and a bed. He told them they had done the right thing by telling him that secrets grew heavier when carried alone. And when Clara finally looked up at him, her eyes held a fragile question he answered without speaking by staying exactly where he was. Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet and persistent. And Samuel understood that Christmas Eve had brought hunger to his door, but Christmas Day had delivered something far more demanding, a truth that asked him not just to care, but to choose whether he would become the kind of man these children could finally stop running from. Once the secret had been spoken, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if even the walls understood that something had shifted and could not be shifted back. And Samuel Carter felt the weight of that change settle into his bones with a clarity he could not argue away. The children moved differently now, not freer exactly, but less guarded, as if telling the truth had loosened a knot they had been carrying for too long, and that easing made the responsibility sharper rather than lighter. Samuel spent the morning taking inventory of practical things, how much food remained, how far the nearest town lay, how visible his ranch was from the road, and each calculation brought him closer to the reality that standing still would not be enough if someone came looking. He considered the options he had avoided since Christmas Eve, the authorities he did not trust to listen carefully, the neighbors who might mean well but talk too freely, and the road that still waited, offering him the familiar relief of distance if he chose to take the children somewhere else and leave the consequences behind. Eli watched him with the quiet awareness of someone who had learned to read adults before they spoke, and when Samuel finally said he needed time to think, the boy nodded, as if time was something they understood better than most. Outside, tracks crossed the snow near the fence line, not fresh enough to demand alarm, but recent enough to remind Samuel that isolation was never absolute, and he spent hours reinforcing small defenses, fixing what could be fixed, not because he believed it would stop everything, but because doing nothing was no longer an option. Clara stayed close, helping when asked and retreating when the air felt heavy, and Samuel noticed how often her eyes went to the road, measuring it with a mix of fear and expectation. By afternoon, he understood that choosing to help meant choosing to be seen, to risk attention, and to accept that protection was not a single act, but an ongoing posture that would ask something of him every day it lasted. The realization did not feel heroic. It felt expensive because it threatened the careful solitude he had built to survive his own losses. As evening approached, and the light faded into another cold night, Samuel gathered the children at the table and told them he would not send them away or hand them over without listening, but that staying would require honesty and patience from all of them, because safety built on lies collapsed quickly. Eli accepted this without relief or protest, and Clara reached for Samuel's sleeve in a gesture so small it nearly escaped notice. And in that moment, Samuel knew the road was no longer his refuge. Standing still had become a choice with a cost, and by choosing it, he had crossed into a life that would demand more courage than leaving ever had. The change began quietly, the way real shifts often did, not with confrontation, but with the subtle awareness that Samuel Carter's ranch was no longer an empty place that could be measured only by distance and silence. He adjusted his routines with intention, working the land at predictable hours, letting smoke rise from the chimney at dawn and dusk, and positioning himself where he could be seen from the road without appearing watchful. Because presence, he had learned, discouraged questions better than secrecy ever could. Eli noticed immediately, understanding that these choices were not about comfort, but signal. And he followed Samuel's lead without being told, keeping to patterns that made the house feel occupied rather than hidden. Clara responded differently, venturing a little farther from the porch each day, testing the ground like someone relearning what safety felt like. And Samuel watched her movements with a quiet vigilance that surprised him, because it did not feel like sacrifice but alignment. A neighbor rode by mid-morning and slowed, tipping his hat and remarking on the smoke, the livestock, the signs of activity, and Samuel answered plainly, offering nothing more than was asked, and the exchange passed without curiosity lingering. That small success mattered more than it should have, because it confirmed that safety could be shaped, not just hoped for. By afternoon, Samuel took the children into town for supplies, choosing daylight and openness over avoidance, and though Eli's shoulders tensed at every unfamiliar face, no one stopped them. No one asked questions that cut too close, and the ordinary nature of the trip did more to steady him than any promise could have. Clara held Samuel's hand only once, briefly when the street grew loud, and then let go on her own, a signal that trust was beginning to stretch rather than cling. On the ride home, Samuel felt the weight of his decision shift again. No lighter but more balanced, because he understood now that protecting them did not require constant fear, only consistent presence. That evening, as the sun fell and the house filled with lamplight, Samuel listened to the children talk quietly near the fire, their voices easing into something closer to normal, and he realized that safety, once visible, invited its own momentum. Whatever had chased them before relied on absence and silence to move unseen, and by standing openly in his own life instead of retreating from it, Samuel had altered the terrain in ways that no single act of defiance ever could. He did not know how long this balance would hold, or what it might eventually cost him, but as he secured the doors and settled in for the night, he understood something he had avoided for years. That staying did not merely protect others, it also reshaped the man who chose to remain, turning isolation into a place that could finally hold more than one future at a time. The next morning brought a clarity Samuel Carter had not expected, because the fear that had sharpened his senses over the past days had begun to give way to something more dangerous, hope. And hope, he knew, invited attention in ways silence never did. He took the children through their routines, as if this were how things had always been, assigning small tasks, explaining decisions, letting Eli see the ledger, and Clara help with the animals, ordinary acts that quietly declared permanence without promising it. Yet even as the house settled into this new rhythm, Samuel felt the risk beneath it, because being known meant leaving traces, and traces could be followed by people who did not need to ask permission. Near midday, a wagon passed on the road and slowed longer than necessary, the driver glancing toward the house with interest that felt measured rather than curious, and Samuel stepped into view deliberately, meeting the look without challenge, allowing the moment to resolve itself in plain sight. The wagon moved on, but the children noticed the exchange, and Eli asked later whether that was how danger began, with small moments that could be explained away, and Samuel answered honestly that it often was, which was why pretending not to see it usually made things worse. He told them that being careful did not mean being invisible, and that sometimes safety came from letting the right people know you existed while refusing to hide from the wrong ones, a balance he had spent years avoiding in his own life. As afternoon wore on, Samuel rode the boundary lines, checking fences and sight lines, not because he expected trouble, but because preparedness steadied him. And when he returned, Clara met him at the gate with a drawing she had made in the dirt, a rough outline of the house with 3 figures standing beside it, the image simple and unguarded in a way that tightened his chest. He said nothing about it, understanding that acknowledgement mattered more than explanation. And as evening approached, he gathered the children and spoke plainly about the days ahead, about the possibility that someone might come asking questions, and about the importance of telling the truth without giving more than was safe. Eli listened carefully, nodding when Samuel said that if danger returned, they would face it together rather than run blindly. And Clara leaned against him with a trust that no longer felt fragile. As night settled again over the ranch and the lamplight softened the walls, Samuel understood that choosing to be known carried its own risk, but it also carried a promise he could no longer deny, that by stepping fully into the lives he had taken in, he was no longer just sheltering them from the past. He was helping shape a future that did not depend on fear to survive. The sign that the past had finally reached them did not arrive as danger announced or declared, but as a question that sounded reasonable enough to almost be believed. And Samuel Carter recognized it the moment a stranger rode up the drive just before noon, slowing near the gate with the easy confidence of someone who expected cooperation. The man tipped his hat politely and said he was looking for 2 children who had gone missing from relatives some days back. His tone practiced, his concern measured, and Samuel felt the room inside him go very still, because the story was shaped too neatly to be coincidence. Eli stood in the doorway behind Samuel, shoulders squared, while Clara hovered just out of sight, and Samuel answered calmly, saying he hadn't seen anyone fitting that description pass through, meeting the man's eyes without aggression or retreat. The stranger smiled in a way that suggested patience rather than relief, remarking that children wandered, that misunderstandings happened, and that returning them would be best for everyone. And Samuel understood then that this was the moment the children had been preparing for long before they ever reached his fence. He asked the man for names, for proof, for something that placed the request within the bounds of truth rather than convenience. And the pause that followed told him more than any admission could have. The stranger shifted in his saddle, irritation flickering through the politeness, and said it wasn't necessary to complicate things, that families handled their own business, and Samuel felt the decision settle fully and without doubt. He told the man plainly that the children were safe, that no one would be taking them anywhere without proper authority and clarity, and that if he had legitimate concern, he could return with someone who did not rely on implication to make demands. The air tightened as the man weighed his options, eyes moving past Samuel toward the house, as if measuring distance and advantage, and Samuel held his ground, not raising his voice or making threats, because steadiness was the language that ended conversations like this. After a long moment, the stranger smiled again, this time without warmth, and said he would be back with answers, turning his horse without waiting for permission. Samuel watched him go until the road emptied, then closed the gate with deliberate care, feeling the cost of visibility press against him in full. Inside, Eli had not moved, his face pale but resolved, and when Samuel told him the man would not be taking them, not today or quietly, Eli nodded once, the smallest release of tension betraying how long he had been bracing for this exact exchange. Clara stepped forward then, and wrapped her arms around Samuel's waist without hesitation. And as he rested his hand on her shoulder, Samuel understood that Christmas Eve had brought hunger to his door. But this day had confirmed the truth beneath it. That choosing to stay meant standing between the vulnerable and the stories told about them, and that he had crossed the last line willingly, knowing there would be no returning to the safety of being alone. The night after the stranger rode away settled heavier than any before it, not because danger still lingered in the dark, but because Samuel Carter finally understood that the life he had been protecting out of habit was gone, replaced by one that demanded intention every single day. He sat at the table long after the children had gone to sleep, the lamp turned low, listening to the wind move across the land and feeling the full weight of what he had chosen. Because standing his ground had not closed the matter, it had only defined his role in it. By morning, he knew what had to be done, not in haste or fear, but with the same steadiness that had carried him this far, and he spoke to Eli first, explaining that safety built on isolation would not last forever, and that they would need allies, records, and truth set down where it could not be quietly undone. Eli listened without panic, nodding as if he had expected this answer all along, and for the first time, Samuel saw not just a child shaped by survival, but one ready to believe that protection could be permanent rather than temporary. Clara joined them at the table, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and when Samuel told her they would be staying together and that no one would take her away without a fight made in daylight and with witnesses, she smiled in a way that was small but complete, as if something inside her had finally stopped bracing. They rode into town that afternoon, openly and without avoidance, Samuel choosing visibility over secrecy, and spoke to the right people with patience rather than urgency, laying out what he knew, what he could prove, and what he would not allow. And though the process was slow and imperfect, it moved forward because it could no longer be ignored. By evening, as they returned to the ranch with papers filed and next steps set in motion, Samuel felt the shift fully take hold, because the secret the children had carried was no longer theirs alone, and the danger that thrived on silence had been denied its favorite ground. That night, as Christmas decorations still lingered in windows across the valley and the season's meaning stretched past a single day, Samuel watched Eli and Clara settle into sleep without the sharp vigilance that had defined them before, and he realized what had truly changed. Everything was not the secret itself, but the moment he chose not to look away from it. He had found 2 starving orphans on Christmas Eve and believed the night would pass like any other, but instead it had drawn him back into a world he had been avoiding, one where responsibility replaced solitude, and where staying was no longer a burden, but a declaration. As the fire burned low and the house held steady around him, Samuel Carter accepted the truth he would carry forward, that the road would always exist for those who needed to run. But real courage lived in the choice to remain, to be seen, and to build something that could not be undone by fear once everything had changed. If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,